There exists an incredibly rare Japanese official Resident Evil prequel novel that came before all of S.T. Perry's RE adaptations. Something that I'm betting a lot of you didn't even know existed. A story that fleshes out Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield in ways you'd probably never expect, and tells of the chaos going on in Raccoon City before the events of the first game. So take a seat as I tell you all about the English translation of this novel known simply as Resident Evil, the book. The story begins with Chris being woken up late at night when his phone rings. As a member of STARS, he knows such a call means someone has died, which is an unfortunate part of his job, as it also reminds him of the phone call that informed him of the death of his parents. But that's not the case this time. Instead, he hears the voice of a dead man, his best friend Billy, a researcher for Umbrella who reportedly died when a corporate jet crashed 3 months prior. Billy goes on to explain that he wasn't on the plane when it crashed. Umbrella had faked his death because they needed him to disappear. Now he needs Chris's help, and has information on the murders happening around Raccoon City, which he'll share as soon as Chris meets with him.
The park near Victory Lake. To the north of the city. Get there as quick as you can. There are people trying to kill me, Chris.
Chris jumps into his Shelby Cobra and speeds off, his mind racing, thinking about his friend. They lost contact for 4 years while Chris was in the Air Force, but immediately reconnected when he came back to Raccoon City, until the plane crash. He's driving fast, and driving distracted. By the time his headlights reveal a woman in the middle of the road, all he can do is swerve and plow his car into the bank alongside the road. He briefly checks himself for broken bones before leaping from his wrecked car, running to check on the woman. To cut down on the gruesome details for YouTube, let's just say she's momentarily conscious, but not in one piece, and her insides are on the outside. In other words, there's nothing he can do for her. A desperate scream gets his attention, and he spots a convertible with its top down on the side of the road, its driver being mauled by some kind of large dog. He grabs his Beretta and fires a shot into the air, hoping to scare it away. Instead, it approaches him, carrying the stench of death and decay. With no other choice, Chris empties his gun into the thing as it moves closer. It barely reacts, but does head off into the forest. Not out of fear, though, it was more like it lost interest. The driver is dead, the woman too, and Chris realizes that the damage done to them resembles the recent murders he'd been investigating, the first of which had happened 6 months prior. Billy will have to wait. Chris gets on his radio and reports to the RPD and stays at the crime scene until officers arrive. Only then does he hop in his not-so-pristine Cobra and head off again for Victory Lake. That concludes Chapter 1, and it does a lot to establish Chris's personality. He's not necessarily the most responsible person. He can be called into work at any time, but implies he had a few too many drinks before going to bed. Even deems it necessary to dump half a bottle of water on his head to get himself moving to meet Billy. Also proves he's not a particularly attentive driver the way he Harry Masons himself off the road. But in the heat of the moment, he tries to do the right thing. Stares down a seemingly wild animal that just attacked 2 people, and also preserves the scene of the crime until backup arrives. The most interesting tidbits revealed here are that his parents were killed when their van was hit by an 18-wheeler, and every late-night call he receives reminds him of the moment he was informed about it. Oh, and Chris also complains about being woken up from his favorite dream, where he's a rock star being swarmed by adoring female fans. If you listen carefully right this minute, off in the distance you can hear the faint sobbing of those weird-ass Nivenfield shippers. Chapter 2 starts with Chris at Victory Park, but there's no sign of Billy. He looks around for a while, remembering that he and Billy used to play there as kids, leading him to check the old boathouse. It's empty, though he finds a gold necklace on the floor, one half of a pair that he had given to Billy and his fiancée Rose. Now there's proof that the caller had actually been his old friend. He returns to the bloody scene he had left earlier, which is now packed with police officers, including Chief Brian Iron. And no, I didn't get that wrong. He's called Iron here, not Irons with an S. But I'm gonna use the latter just because it's what I'm used to. Irons immediately grills Chris about fleeing from the area, though he quickly makes up a cover story about chasing after someone, or something, he saw. Even here, Irons isn't shown in a positive light. He's basically described to be a greasy asshole who terrorizes stars at every opportunity. And Chris, understandably, tells him to back off. And I really like this bit that comes next, so I'll just read it to you now. For a long moment he glared at me with the self-righteous fervor of a Wild West evangelist. The man was a walking ego. I'd even heard that he had planned to run for mayor in the next election. 10 years before, Raccoon City had been a sleepy farming community, and the mayor was kind of a glorified dog catcher. But then the umbrella company moved in and built a large research plant, and suddenly there were new faces and new buildings all over the place. Before anyone knew what was happening, half the population of Raccoon City was directly dependent on the umbrella company for their livelihood. Suddenly the mayor's job was a plum to be squeezed, a position of power from which a crafty politician might line his own pockets. As the population swelled, crime had also increased. It got so bad that the company proposed establishing a special crime-fighting force, paid for in half with corporate funds. The city had agreed, and STARS was formed. In only 3 paragraphs, it establishes the history of Raccoon City, the corruption of Brian Irons, and the origin of STARS. The confrontation between both men is interrupted when the local news reporters show up, and Irons eagerly greets them to mug for the camera. The deputy chief, who isn't named here, also questions Chris, who then talks about his encounter with that big, terrifying dog that was deadly, fearless, and seemingly impervious to bullets. The deputy chief decides, oh, well, clearly it's just your average, ordinary, everyday case of rabies, yes sir. And now I'm left to assume this schmuck's name is Barney freaking Fife. There's a reference two people will understand. See you at Sunday bingo, fellow geezers. Chris leaves again, and that's the end of Chapter 2. One that effortlessly lays some foundations for world building in the Resident Evil universe. And I do love the justification for a unit like STARS existing in such a small town, as this was long before Raccoon City was retconned into being a large city. Although idiots do love to argue with me about that. Chris arrives at the RPD and steps into the STARS office, where an emotional Barry Burton argues with the calm, steely Albert Wesker. There are now 5 confirmed victims killed in the same gruesome way, and Barry is tired of STARS sitting on the sidelines while innocent people die. Wesker simply states that they'll act when Irons issues an order. Jill Valentine and Joseph Frost overhear this and interrupt.
You've been giving us the same answer for months now,
Jill said, her big eyes flashing. I liked her. With her short hair and slim body, one might underestimate her strength and stamina. In reality, she was a tough, intelligent police officer who had pulled more than one STARS member out of trouble.
Yeah. Every time we even bring up the subject, you give us a lecture on the chain of command.
We couldn't function without chain of command,
Wesker said calmly. He was like that. Cool, collected, sure of his position. You never really knew what the man was thinking, only that whatever he had in mind, it was going to be done his way. But Jill insists things have changed. One of their own encountered the killer now, and it's at that point when the whole team turn their attention to him. And he hesitates, because again, he knows he'll sound crazy if he starts talking about bulletproof dogs. He sighs, and tells them. Not about Billy, though. Talking about a dead best friend who's alive again might be too much of a complication. He's keeping that one to himself for now. The others don't really want to believe his story. But they do, because he's Chris Redfield and he doesn't make a habit of spreading bullshit, especially on the job. Wesker demands a written report and dismisses Chris to go write one. But Jill follows for a private conversation. She knows him well enough to notice when he's keeping a secret, and calls him out on it, practically interrogating him, though he continues dodging her questions, until there's a moment where we get some insight on Jill's motivations. The sound of children playing outside reverberated through the long hall, and Jill shivered at the sound. Visibly shaken, she walked to the window and looked out. The light coming in cast golden highlights in her hair, and despite her interrogation this morning, I had a flash of how she was feeling. Jill loved kids, and they loved her back. Several of her daring escapades as a member of STARS had made the local news, and thousands of youngsters now looked upon her as their heroine. Then the trill of a young girl's laugh echoed from below, and I suddenly remembered why Jill was so upset. Her neighbor's children, 2 young girls Jill had become a second mother to, had been among the beast's first victims. They'd been on a camping trip with their parents when they wandered into the nearby woods. When their parents found them an hour later, they were already dead, their bodies horribly mangled. I'm sorry, Jill. I know what those kids meant to you.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I'm not getting anywhere with you. Later.
Give me a little time, Jill. I think an important part of the puzzle was dropped in my lap last night, but I can't be sure yet. When I am, you are the first one I'll call.
Guess I'll have to settle for that.
Subscribe for more like this. And that's the end of Chapter 3. We sadly don't get to kick off a buddy cop story starring Chris and Jill as they track down some clues, but what we do get here is pretty good. It instantly establishes the dynamic between these members of Alpha Team and their frustrations with Wesker's leadership. Wesker himself is portrayed as being uptight and by the book, but his dialogue while arguing with Barry gives off the impression, to me anyway, that he chooses his words very carefully to still come across as sympathetic, regardless of whether he feels any real semblance of sympathy or not. Basically, he's got that sociopath mastered. Jill is really the star of this chapter, though. The series desperately needs this kind of Jill. One who can be highly motivated, tough, and also refuse to take any BS, while still being warm and vulnerable. Or, human. It's also nice to see how she and Chris interact. There is a certain level of respect between them. She noticed he was being sketchy and grilled him on it, but in the end, with some disappointment, leaves it up to him to do whatever he feels has to be done instead of ratting him out to Wesker. The fourth chapter is pretty short and doesn't really have a lot going on, but it's still entertaining. Chris decides his best course of action is to stroll right in through Umbrella's front door with only a flimsy cover story prepared. He's not a cop. No. He's the executor of Billy Rabbitson's estate, here to collect information on his employment and see if he had any insurance policies or things like that. Which is all fine and good, except Billy's fake death was months ago, and he has a family. He's able to get past the receptionist pretty easily by playing the sad, grieving friend card, and gets sent up to meet with the director of human resources, who sees through the BS immediately. Because, all that information was sent to Billy's family months ago. Oops. Still, Chris plays it off as a misunderstanding and prepares to leave, pausing long enough to tell the director that he's a member of STARS, just to see the surprise wash over him. It was pretty funny to see Chris trying to infiltrate Umbrella with no real forethought. Keep in mind, he doesn't know yet just how evil and corrupt the company is. All he knows at this point is that they're involved with the local government and that his buddy claims they faked his death, which he's still never gotten any evidence about. So maybe shining a spotlight on himself and his team wasn't a great idea, as I imagine Umbrella would take an interest in him specifically after this. You can draw a pretty straight line from this moment to that RE3 epilogue where Jill later goes to Chris's place and finds it ransacked with him missing in action. The one where either someone had clearly been stabbed in his hideout, or Chris just ate some bad Taco Bell and got a case of the runs while on the run. Either way, that's just unfortunate. An absolutely exhausted Chris returns home and gets kicked right in the balls by the newspaper waiting on his doorstep. It seems the local reporters have decided to portray him as a bumbling moron who allowed a murderer to get away. With tensions rising in Raccoon City, that's not great for him. His answering machine is full of messages from those same reporters, plus Wesker and even his sister. It's interesting to note that she wasn't named here, by the way. Makes me wonder if this was written before Claire was finalized for Resident Evil 2. Within moments, Chris begins to feel like he's being watched, and he retrieves his shotgun and sidearm from the bedroom just in time for a foul-smelling attacker to burst through the window and grab him by the throat. He fights off this rotten fruit ninja, but it vanishes as abruptly as it appears. He runs outside, trying to give chase, only to see Jill emerge from the tree line. What the hell is she doing there, you ask? Well, it just so happens that her Harley broke down on the way to Chris's house, so she took a shortcut through the woods. Jill understandably wants to know why he's waving around a shotgun like a lunatic outside his house, which also has a broken window. And the brazen bugger still tries to play it cool. It's a long story, Jill, I said, not wanting to tell her I'd been attacked by a corpse. I figured that as part of the STARS team, she'd find out what we were up against soon enough. Look, I've got something important to do. Can I drop you somewhere?
Bitch, are you for real?
And it's at this point when the two of them exchange dialogue that isn't just cringe-inducingly awful, but it also reeks of peak late 2000s era Shadow the Hedgehog fanfiction writing. Jill fixed me with her Rock of Gibraltar look, the kind of stare that says only the total destruction of the planet will sway her.
Why are you so anxious to get rid of me?
Whatever put such a wicked thought in your head?
Cut the bull, Chris. I know you. You're working on some angle, aren't you? You always were a lone wolf.
And you want to join my solitary pack?
I would kill for the chance.
I didn't need to ask her who she would kill. Jill, you're the most beautiful person who's ever threatened me. Okay? You're in.
What the hell is even that?
Okay, there's some things to keep in mind here. One, this was translated to English from Japanese, and you never know what liberties were taken with the localization process unless you can read the original yourself. Two, this was written after the first game released. These characters didn't have fully established personalities and backstories, and really, this was the first tangible piece of media outside of the game that was meant to establish them. So I guess Chris is a try-hard neckbeard who fancies himself a badass lone wolf, and Jill is a desperate and lonely legbeard who buys into it. Good to know. Hound Wolf from Resident Evil Village also makes a lot of sense now, since I can easily imagine this Chris nicknaming himself Alpha and hanging out with a bunch of dorks calling themselves things like Night Howl and Tundra. And look, I'm not just roasting the dialogue here. It's extremely jarring that a zombie just instant transmissions in and out of the scene for a quick throat hug and then Jill wanders out of the woods a second later. It's contrived. It screams of, well, there's been no zombies in this zombie story for a while, so I might just put one here now. But oh wait, the chapter's not done yet, because with our buddy cop duo now working together, they jump into Chris's famous Shelby and speed off. I started the Shelby, floored the accelerator, and lit up the tires across the front lawn. The sleek Sportster roared down the road like a rocket, pinning Jill to the back of her seat.
What is this, the Batmobile?
There was a call from Wesker on my answering machine. Do you know what he wants?
Your hide on his wall.
You see, the consequences of Chris's ill-fated attempt at going undercover to talk to Umbrella HR are now in full swing. The HR director called Irons chewed out Wesker, and now Wesker sent Jill to pick up Chris and bring him to the station. But Chris is a rebel who doesn't play by the rules, and now Jill's riding shotgun.
For both our sakes, this angle of yours better pan out, Chris. Know what I mean?
If we turn up something important, we're instant darlings of the media, and Brian and Wesker won't dare touch us. If we come up empty, there'll be 2 hides on Wesker's wall.
If I'm going to be skinned alive, I'd like to know why. What's going on, Chris?
For the next 10 minutes, I filled in Jill as I drove. That's all I can tell you. I finished. I'm convinced my old friend Billy is not only alive, but that he has something to do with the terrible murders in Raccoon City.
It's all so fantastic. If I didn't know you, Chris, I'd say you made the whole thing up.
And that finally ends the wonkiest chapter so far. Thank you to my generous supporters. Valentine arrive at Billy's cabin in the woods sometime later, and the door is, of course, locked. Jill couldn't resist.
You forgot to get the key from Rose. Am I right?
You're right. You're also cruel. Jill rolled her eyes and took a hairpin from her short bangs. She bent to the lock, and maybe a full 2 seconds later, the door was open.
After you, Chris,
she said, condescension dripping from her voice like honey from a hive. I swallowed my pride and walked past her. They look around for a while, but notice a distinct lack of Billy's. Just as they're about to leave, they sniff out a putrid stench in the air, one Chris has become too familiar with. A moment later, we heard them, outside in the yard. But it wasn't the normal sound of approaching footfalls. No, the creatures coming at us were dragging their club-like feet through the dust as if their legs were too heavy to lift. From the noise, I guessed that at least 4 or 5 creatures were nearing the cabin. Jill and I stood riveted to the floor, our eyes locked on the open doorway. Outside, a chorus of spine-chilling moans began to rise, a diabolical dirge from the dead. We braced for the attack, and seconds later the creatures burst through the door. They went for us like huge, 2-legged pit bulls, and I could hear Jill screaming as we fought for our lives. Instead of using their guns, Chris and Jill grapple with the zombies for a while, giving Chris some time to really analyze and describe just how gross and gory and smelly they are. Just as he and Jill are about to be forced to reload their save, Billy bursts in and shouts some solid advice from the doorway.
Shoot them.
Only then does Chris fire the shotgun he's had on him this entire time. And he watches as the zombie's wound regenerates, prompting more advice from Billy.
Shoot them in the head. That stops pretty much any living creatures. Do you even biology, bro?
Chris frees himself and then Jill, and takes so long checking on her that by the time they turn their attention to Billy, he's become a feast for 3 other zombies. Oops. So they kill them and drag what's left of Billy into the kitchen, barricading the door behind them. Billy's not having a great day on account of his throat and his chest having windows now, but Chris still seems optimistic. Hang in there, old buddy. We'll get you to a hospital. You're gonna make it. You gotta keep thinking that, Billy. You're going to make it. Thankfully, Billy isn't an idiot and immediately tries to share as much info as he can. Says he was held in a secret research lab, forced to create something called the T-virus alongside other scientists that created zombies. And he's the only one who escaped. And then he dies because this version of Chris and Jill freaking suck. So they promptly blast their way back to the car and hop in. I put 5 miles between us and the zombies before I eased my foot back off the accelerator. I looked over at Jill. Her face was still ashen, but that determined look was back. I'm glad you were here with me.
I'm not.
And then they joke about wanting to see Wesker's face when they make their report and speed merrily back to the RPD. And the chapter ends just as quickly as Billy's life. R.I.P. Billy. You deserved a better friend than Chris Lone Wolf Redfield. They get to the RPD in the middle of a crisis as Wesker is pacing around the office while Richard Aiken is yelling into a radio. Star's Bravo team is missing. The locations of all the murders seemed to be happening all around one point on the map, where an old mansion happens to be located. Here it's not referred to as the Spencer Mansion or even the Arklay Mansion, but rather the Old City Guest House. Wesker had sent Bravo to investigate and they haven't been heard from since. So Chris and Jill spill the beans about Billy, Umbrella, the zombies, all of it. And the captain is suspiciously quick to believe such an outlandish story.
It's all just crazy enough to make sense. A leading research scientist gets shanghaied to work on a hush-hush project, and something goes wrong. Real wrong. The researcher, Billy, ends up creating a diabolical virus that turns ordinary men and women into soulless robotic killers.
So what do we do, Captain?
We're going to return in force to the place where Bravo vanished.
And before long, Star's Alpha team flies to the site, and more specifically here it's described that they land on the front lawn of the old guest house. They pause for a moment before exiting the chopper, hearing the cries of the undead all around them. The end. And boy, howdy, that book really hit the bed halfway through, huh? Now let me talk about the last chapter a bit before I broadly review the whole thing. It's short and feels rushed, as if the author had a page limit and found himself having to suddenly race to the finish line. Another thing is, obviously Richard is not supposed to be with Alpha Team. Even the chapter's illustration in the Japanese version shows Joseph being the one handling the radio, making it extra odd. And I suspect this may be an issue with the localization, which could very well be the cause of a lot of problems with this official English translation. Now, you can find the Japanese version on the Internet Archive, but I can't read Japanese and therefore can't compare the two versions of this story. But there's a brief note on the Resident Evil Wiki that states the translator took a number of liberties with the English version of the book. It only cites a couple of examples, one of which is the presence of more product placement in this English version. But it also points out that originally it wasn't Jill who Chris talked to in Chapter 5. It was Rose, Billy's fiancée, who only gets a couple of brief mentions in the English story. And the Chapter 5 illustration shows this. I could be wrong, but I'd assume that also means that Rose is the one he went to the cabin with. That's a pretty massive creative liberty to take already, but there's also an illustration that appears to show Chris and Rose with a wounded Billy, except a hunter is shown, not a group of zombies. So basically, I don't know what the hell's going on. All I can do is look at this English version, and it's a mess. If you were to read it on its own, just as a book you randomly picked up one day with no knowledge of Resident Evil at all, it starts off pretty good. Chris is a likable protagonist to follow, Raccoon City and its political inner workings make for an intriguing setting, and that first roadside encounter with a Cerberus was shocking and thrilling. Plus, the mystery with Billy's fake death and the ominous Umbrella Company is set up pretty well. But the wheels start wobbling around Chapter 4 with Chris's ultimately pointless visit to Umbrella, and then the wheels fall off in Chapter 5 with ninja zombies and terrible dialogue, and it's downhill from there. As a Resident Evil prequel, it fails spectacularly. It serves up too much information to the characters far too soon. Here, before the events of the first game even begin, Chris and Jill know Umbrella developed something called the T-Virus that mutates people and animals into nearly unstoppable monsters. They don't know the hows or the whys, and they at least remain unaware that Wesker is a traitor, but that's still way too much information to arm them with before they even get to the mansion. There's way too many continuity errors for this story to be an actual prequel to the events of the first game, even for a series of games that today has a reputation for its bad continuity. Fans of the S.T. Perry Resident Evil books probably felt a sense of déjà vu earlier, right? Certain elements like Chris's friend Billy and Jill's friendship with her neighbor's daughters were also used in the Resident Evil novels by S.T. Perry. Perry herself hadn't read this prequel story though. When you read interviews with her, she doesn't even remember where that info came from, because she had no contact with Capcom. However, her editor, Marco Palmieri, did. And since he was the one providing her notes and corrections, she has suggested that those backstory tidbits came from him. There were differences though, especially with Billy. Perry's version of Billy still worked for Umbrella, but his death had never been faked. Instead, he simply called one night and begged Chris to meet him at a local diner, but never showed up and was never seen again. I would talk more about the S.D. Perry books, but that'll be a series of videos I do down the road. I don't run a Resident Evil channel, so my next video will be related to one of my other interests. Subscribe and stay tuned if you like. To wrap up, would I recommend Resident Evil the book? Nah, it was promising, but really crapped out by the end. But if you want to read it for yourself, Project Umbrella has it available on their site. That's where I read it, and they've done a great job preserving lots of Resident Evil media. That's all I got for you guys today. I'm Baffled, and hope to see you all next time. Bye! Hey, I always thought these Spencer properties had traps set up. Guess this is just a normal mansion. Aw, come on, that's so lazy! If you enjoyed this video, please consider funding more. For as little as $2 a month, you too can help a sleep-deprived buffoon make pointless videos. Subscribe to my Patreon to get early access to videos, updates, and sneak peeks at what I'm working on, the occasional exclusive reaction vids, VR Let's Plays, and more. Plus, if I ever get enough patrons for it, I can eventually start doing polls to decide what my next videos will be, and maybe some other fun stuff down the road. And if Patreon isn't your thing, a one-time donation to my Ko-fi would be appreciated just as much. Or if you just plain don't wanna, that's cool too. Thanks for watching.